Mes chers amis, bonjour et je voudrais vous souhaiter la bienvenue au nom de la Fondation Jean Monnet pour l'Europe pour notre colloque international de cette année sur le thème « L'Europe dans le monde ». Moi, je vais commencer avec quelques remarques pour mettre en scène, disons, cette idée de l'Europe dans le monde. Je vais inviter, après mon discours, notre ancien président, notre ami et collègue José María Gil Robles pour prononcer un discours. Il y aura quelques questions et interventions, si vous voudriez bien, et puis la suite des choses. Mais allons-y alors. Excellence, et je suis très content de regarder que la présence de quelques ambassadeurs, ambassadrices. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue, chers invités, chers membres de la Fondation, mesdames et messieurs. J'ai le plaisir et le privilège de vous accueillir ici aujourd'hui au nom de la Fondation de Jean Monnet pour l'Europe, au colloque que nous organisons sur le thème de l'Europe dans le monde. Et je dois dire que je vais continuer un moment en anglais, mais quand même, c'est pour prévenir ceux qui voudraient écouter en anglais. Je suis en particulier heureux d'accueillir l'ancien président de la Fondation, mon prédécesseur immédiat, le président José María Gil Robles, et aussi mon prédécesseur comme président du Parlement européen. Il va nous entretenir dans un moment du rôle international de l'euro. Je suis aussi heureux de vous présenter M. Chenyi Nagy, doctorant à l'Université de Genève et nouveau vice-président du think tank Foros, qui animera cette soirée ici. Et nous sommes très contents de la continuation aussi positive avec les relations entre Foros et la Fondation Jean Monnet pour l'Europe. Pour ce colloque, nous bénéficions de magnifiques partenariats et soutiens dans le Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies de l'Institut universitaire européen de Florence, le World Economic Forum, le Forum de politique étrangère Foros, dont certains membres animeront, comme j'ai déjà dit, la colloque. If you would permit me, I propose to try to set the scene a little bit on this wider theme through a few introductory remarks. Europe in the world, like so many similar themes, begs the question at the outset as to what one is referring to when speaking of Europe. Geographically, Europe extends from the Atlantic to the Urals and from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. Geopolitically, it does not extend in those directions with the same sense of unity as its territory might suggest. And of course, I'm conscious that we meet in Switzerland, militarily non-aligned, a non-member of the EU, and yet evidently quintessentially European. And so we're dealing with something that is a large canvas. We meet on a continent where a positive partnership with Russia would make great sense, but not at the price of turning a blind eye to creeping authoritarianism, revanchism, aggression, and the self-enriching elite power vertical. We meet on the eve of what will be a very contested European Parliament election in May 2019, where identity politics will play a significant role. Europe's role in the world will be fashioned to a significant extent by the degree of shared European vision and values in Europe itself. In a recent short paper, I observed, and I quote, that multiple and consecutive economic and migration crises of the past decade have left their electoral mark across the face of our continent. They have produced greater interstate tensions and policy cleavages. They've led to more contested and more fragmented and more nationalistic tendencies in politics within member states. Striking a balance during the economic crisis between fiscal rigour and fiscal rigidity has proved elusive. The immigration crisis, to some degree, has been contained, but the radioactive political half-life of its consequences has not. The fundamental values of liberal democracy, truths many of us thought we held to be eternal, are being stress-tested too often for comfort inside our union. To this can be added the first act of post-war disintegration in the form of Brexit, with its current confounding catalogue of complexity, which is dominating politics in the United Kingdom to the virtual exclusion of everything else in the political life of that nation, and it is casting its long and distracting shadow over EU affairs. What is undeniable is that the world is changing, and consequently locating Europe's place in it is a timely exercise. Pax Americana has been described by some commentators as transforming today into Crux Americana, posing questions about the durability of the US-led rules-based international order that has served Europe and the wider world so well since the end of the Second World War. Old certainties are strained by a new wave of transactional politics in transatlantic relations and international affairs. There is evidence of rising geopolitical tensions in a new era of great power competition. Trade disputes and a rise in protectionism are resulting in a slowdown of global growth. The world stands at the threshold of the fourth industrial revolution, heralding unparalleled technological advancement, but accompanied also by deep-seated individual and societal insecurities. There is less inequality between states than before, but evidence of rising inequality within states, which is breaking part of the traditional social contract. Increased social polarization is resulting in challenges to political systems and the governability of states. We are, in the words of the chief executive of the World Wildlife Fund, the first generation to know that we are destroying the planet, and the last generation to be able to do anything about it. Just when the world needs to act cohesively, like never before, to fight climate change, its institutional capacity for cohesion is fracturing. The world as we've known it is undergoing profound change, and Europe, however we define it, needs to understand this and to respond accordingly. Populism of the left and right in Europe has been steadily on the rise for the past 2 decades. Its support base in voter terms has risen from 1 vote in 12 at the turn of the new millennium in the year 2000 to more than 1 vote in 4 by 2017, and let us see where that tendency brings us in coming elections. This is a pan-European phenomenon, evident in EU and non-EU states alike. Of more than 100 such parties that have been studied and identified in 39 European countries, 3 in 4 are populists of the right and 1 in 4 are populists of the left. These are strongest in Central and Eastern Europe, but by no means confined to Central and Eastern Europe. There is today an unbroken chain of populist governments with majority or significant minority populist party participation, stretching from the Baltic to the Adriatic, from Poland to Italy, from Stettin to Trieste, to echo the words of Winston Churchill's famous speech in Fulton, Missouri in March of 1946, when he spoke of an iron curtain being drawn across the face of our continent. The growing scale of extent of this trend suggests that for the foreseeable future, this phenomenon is here to stay. The question is not whether this will influence the shaping of policy, in particular at EU level, but rather the extent to which it will succeed in doing so. The dividing lines today, I believe, are less about left versus right in politics and more about open versus closed. Last year, sharing a platform with Marine Le Pen at her party's annual Congress, Steve Bannon, the former and probably future advisor of President Trump, boasted, and I quote, "History is on our side." He said to loud applause and stamping feet, reading the French newspaper reporting of that time, "Let them call you a racist. Let them call you xenophobes. Let them call you nativists. Wear it like a badge of honor, because every day we are getting stronger and they are getting weaker." These kinds of messages validate behaviors which are intolerable. They validate them even if they don't directly seek to do so. At an extreme end of this spectrum of validation is the worrying emergence of white supremacist terrorism, of which the most recent episode was in Christchurch, New Zealand, that left 50 dead in its wake, and its earlier manifestation in Norway in 2011, where 69 young people were murdered at a summer camp following 8 being killed in a bomb in downtown Oslo. White supremacists will now add a whole new universe to terrorist watch lists throughout Europe and throughout the civilized world, lists already populated with large numbers of radicalized Islamists. The EU cyber intelligence and vigilance have improved, but afford no room for complacency. The Munich Security Conference has established itself as Europe's primary annual moment of reflection on the state of the international order. A friend of mine who's attended every conference describes this year's meeting at Munich to me as the Munich Insecurity Conference. It was marked by a pervasive sense of the simultaneous emergence of great power competition, especially between the USA and China, and a visible leadership vacuum in the liberal international order. 5 years ago in Munich, when President Putin annexed Crimea and underwrote the conflict in eastern Ukraine, he was considered to be then the major cause of global destabilization. Today, as he questions free trade, NATO, and the Western values that prevailed since World War II, as he describes the EU as a foe, attacks allies, supports Brexit, and comforts autocrats, the indispensable underwriter that all that went before, the USA under President Trump, has become the great disruptor. This prompted Wolfgang Ischinger, the convener of the Munich conference, to talk, and I quote, of an epochal shift. An era is ending, he said, and the rough outlines of a new political age are only beginning to emerge. In part, of course, this is an issue of leadership. And the question is, who is there to lead and sustain the liberal order of the past 7 decades, if not the USA? The EU could be such a leader, but a look at its 4 largest states suggests perhaps we need to think about this. Chancellor Merkel's 4-term period of office is approaching its end. The disunited kingdom struggles to define its own role, let alone its role in the wider global order. It does so at the most inopportune time in decades. President Macron has the instinct to lead, but is distracted by matters of governability at home, with Gilets jaunes and the hardcore anarchistic Casseurs. Italy is setting itself on a different course for the moment. In principle, a shared EU sovereignty could offer such leadership, but its emergence is curtailed by the foreign policy sensitivities of its key member states. In part, this epochal shift, to quote Ischinger, flows from the evolving strategic interests of key players. The West gambled that opening the WTO to China would increase China's integration into the global economy, which happened, and that economic liberalism might fuel a rise in democratic liberalism in the Middle Kingdom, which did not. China is proud of its model of a market economy with Chinese characteristics. Its Made in China 2025 policy is a state-driven deep dive into an ambitious strategic program of future technological advance and leadership, capable not just of advancing China, but in principle of leading the world. The stresses in China-US relations are fueled for the moment, in my view, less by traditional defence-related security concerns and more by insecurities arising from this high-tech challenge. In this scenario, Moscow is not a geopolitical challenger, but a spoiler. Russia is a disruptive force in Ukraine, most recently on the Kerch Straits, in the multiple frozen conflicts in its near abroad, by its willingness to meddle in the electoral process of other states, in its re-entry to the Middle East through Syria, through poisoning its enemies on foreign soil, and by the propensity for cyber attacks on those that it chooses to do so. While, of course, demographic or financial fragilities could emerge to slow down or stifle the rise of China, it is and will remain dominant among emerging superpowers, and in time it could become the dominant global power. What China and Russia share is a desire, and I quote, to shape a world consistent with their authoritarian model, in the words in his resignation letter of the departing Secretary of Defense in Washington, D.C., General Mattis. That resignation, together with those of the head of National Security Council, the Secretary of State, and the US Ambassador to the United Nations, marked a personnel transition in the administration to a more accommodating, Trump-friendly group of senior advisors. In truth, the risk to the international order probably is threatened more by populism at home in the USA than the rise of powers abroad. President Trump's instinct for playing to his electoral base, which propelled him to power, has increased and not diminished since he took office. He appears to me to be in a state of permanent campaigning, punctuated when necessary by the demands of office, the reverse of most presidents, who are occupied by the demands of office, punctuated occasionally by campaigning. President Trump shows scant regard for the alliances carefully built and nurtured over time by the USA. And I would argue that this was and can be a source of invaluable, asymmetric, soft power, whose currency, I regret to say, is being devalued and undermined at present. The USA announced recently its intention to withdraw from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty earlier this year, blaming Russia for alleged breaches. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty may follow suit in 2021. Stepping away from these old bipolar accords from the Cold War era, negotiated with Russia, will make the world a more dangerous place, as it heralds the prospect of a new arms race, which in future will include China in the hunt for the holy grail of total spectrum dominance. The unravelling bipolar accords are happening in a context where no multilateral alternative is in place to contain their negative consequences. America's European allies stand in the front line of potential vulnerability, but were not even consulted. This unilateralism was replicated by troop withdrawal or reduction announcements for Syria and Afghanistan, by the freezing of joint military exercises in South Korea, not to mention the non-military unilateral equivalents, such as questioning the WTO, resiling or threatening to resile from the Paris Climate Accord, switching the US embassy to Jerusalem, or most recently suggesting to Israel that they should permanently occupy the Golan Heights, contrary to UN resolutions. All this has prompted the conclusion at Munich this year that the USA era of benign hegemony is over. This is not my conclusion. This is the conclusion of the Munich Security Report. The European Union is the world's most advanced and integrated regional polity. Its bilateral and multilateral relations are built on a dense network of treaties and agreements. As a regulatory superpower, the EU has relied on and profited from the open and liberal post-war global order. As a soft power construct, its interests lie in the preservation of that order to the greatest extent possible. The EU is in the process of recalibrating relations with China that are more realistic, assertive, and multifaceted, to quote its own recent document. China was recently described by the European Commission in its review of EU-China relations as a cooperation partner, for example, in common views about fighting climate change, as an economic competitor, and as a systemic rival, promoting alternative models of governance. This strategic distillation of EU interests is complicated by the fact that already, and I think one may expect increasingly so in the future, EU member states or European states and businesses can expect to find themselves squeezed like meat in a sandwich between Washington, D.C. and Beijing as these more aggressively pursue their respective economic, commercial, and political interests. The Trump administration has already threatened through its ambassador in Berlin to scale back intelligence sharing with Germany if it opts, through its own national sovereignty and autonomy, to use the Huawei 5G technology. This is a first. Likewise, the UK has been cautioned by Washington that the use of Chinese technology in 5G could jeopardize its national security. Meanwhile, Canada found several of its citizens arrested in China within days of arresting Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, on the foot of a US extradition warrant. When South Korea deployed a US anti-missile system, Chinese tourists were redirected from there by way of Chinese retaliation. Italy's recent decision to become the first EU founding member state to sign a memorandum of understanding with China on the Belt and Road Initiative has met with explicit concerns by the White House, which argued that the Belt and Road Initiative is, quote, made in China for China. China is active in the pursuit of European Belt and Road Initiative partnerships. It has institutionalized this in a soft way through a series of so-called 16+1 meetings hosted by EU member states and political leaders. This consists of all Central and Eastern European countries, the 8 that joined in 2004, together with Romania and Bulgaria and the states of the Western Balkans. In Piraeus in Greece, COSCO, the state-owned Chinese ocean shipping company, which is the third largest Chinese company in this sector, started by buying 35-year franchises to 2 of the Greek ports' container shipping terminals in 2008. As a byproduct of the Greek economic crisis, in 2016, COSCO bought a 67% majority stake in the Port Authority of Piraeus, becoming the primary operator. This port is now the second largest container port in the Mediterranean, which it was not, and the Chinese investment plan is to make it the largest port in the Mediterranean, which I count on it being. China now has stakes in 13 European ports, accounting today for around 10% of the EU's shipping container capacity, and this has been growing. These are simply facts. People can make their interpretations as they will as to what those facts could mean. As regards energy, the EU imports 2/3 of its energy and counts on Russia as one of its major suppliers of gas and oil. In Europe, about 40% of member state natural gas imports are delivered from Russian sources. Russia supplies almost half of Germany's supply of natural gas. That dependency rises to almost 100% on Russian natural gas in some EU member states. More than 1/3 of crude oil imports by European states in the OECD come from Russia. With the economic recovery, EU energy demand and Russian supply both increased. There is a dense network of bilateral deals between Russia and individual member states through its energy proxies such as Gazprom and Rosneft, and this is the norm. In this context, the EU remains a significant but second-order player and will do so for as long as member states choose bilateral deals with Russia or China or whoever else over multilateral deals through the EU. The economic benefits of this supply chain, of course, are positive for both sides, purchasers and sellers, and these benefits have overridden the political factors such as sanctions and so on, and that flow has not been disrupted in spite of the deterioration in relations over Crimea. It has been, in fact, a case of business as usual and more business than before. Where national capitals choose to privilege their bilateral relations with China on investment, or Russia on energy, or the USA on security, or whatever it might be, ipso facto, they impinge on the capacity of the EU to develop a coherent and consistent foreign policy at EU level. Encouraging disagreement among those who might oppose you is the classic definition of divide and rule. At times, this practice seems to leave EU foreign policy aspirations filled with as many holes as a mature Swiss Emmental. If I look at the recent announcement by Romania, an EU member state, that it intends to follow the US lead in moving its embassy to Jerusalem, which cannot be par hasard. This is not an accident. There has been a lot of discussion somehow, somewhere. These things begin to fillet the capacity for a coherent and deep foreign policy emergence in the EU by the very act of permitting divide and rule, and they're not random events. When the EU acts and speaks with one voice, it can exert real leverage. We've seen this, and I don't want to deviate into it, in the matter of Brexit, where member states, the European Council, the European Parliament, the European Commission, the chief negotiator, have acted in total concert, and where the unity of purpose has given them a powerful capacity to manage this process, in spite of many, many attempts by British diplomacy and politicians to leverage some piece of divide and rule, which in this case didn't work. Asylum and immigration policy has been the most divisive issue in recent years within the EU. Internally, as I said, it's led to cleavages between member states, and in particular between Central European states and the European Commission. It has resulted in the temporary reintroduction of border controls in the Schengen area. Traditional boundaries between internal and external security and between home affairs and foreign affairs are increasingly blurred. Perhaps the most visible consequence has been the conduct of EU foreign policy, which has exhibited a capacity for what I might call realpolitik in its willingness to cooperate with authoritarian rulers in return for assistance with migration control. The EU moved outside its comfort zone in March 2016 when it concluded a €6 billion deal with Turkey on migration. 2 years ago, just after that, with Italian backing, a deal was done to spend tens of millions on funding the Libyan Coast Guard with the same intended purpose. Tensions flared at a subsequent EU-Africa summit in 2017 over a proposal to forcibly return migrants and the associated EU funding. And last month, we had the EU's first summit with the Arab League, held in Egypt and hosted and co-chaired by President Sisi. This exercise in realpolitik stands in a rather sharp contrast to the more elevated aspirations as stated by the Barcelona process of 1995 and the subsequent establishment of the Union for the Mediterranean of 2008, where there was more of an emphasis on what I call the holistic promotion of individual opportunity and human rights, sustainable development, and so on. I'm going to say that the dire conditions of migrants, the abuse of their human rights, and their exposure to human slavery and trafficking, which have been criticised in a very open way by human rights organisations, speak to the other side of this coin, the bit that we don't see so much, that is part of this gear shift to what I've called the realpolitik. The desire to quell internal political dissent inside the EU has prevailed over these sensitivities. in the pursuit of short-term mechanisms to stem the flow of migrants to the EU. To the extent that this may work, it is a sticking plaster solution. The tributaries of migrant flow need to be addressed at source. And as we know, with a population expected to double by 2050 in Africa from around 1.2 to 2.5 billion, predominantly, of course, composed of young people, the African continent will be the great challenge on our doorstep. EU-Africa relations are moving away from donor-based models towards long-term cooperation built on a stronger, deeper, but more political partnership. Of course, the EU is now one of many players in this new political and diplomatic scramble for Africa, but one whose political and territorial exposure to failed states and Africa's expected demographic explosion make it, Europe, especially vulnerable to the consequences of failure or breakdown. Late 2017 saw the emergence of the EU's Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, having lain dormant in the Lisbon Treaty since 2009. 25 of the current 28 member states are participating. The exceptions are the United Kingdom, because it plans to withdraw, Denmark, because it had an opt-out, and Malta, because it has opted out. Together with the coordinated annual review of defence, the European Defence Fund and the military planning and conduct capability exercise, it forms part of a new defence package for the EU. As regards NATO, only 1/4 of its member states meet the targeted spend of 2% of GDP on defence. More than half of its 29 member states spend less than 1.5% of GDP, including notably Germany, Italy and Spain. The German spend, or the polemics around it, has been a particularly contentious political issue between Berlin and Washington, D.C. The climate that we're looking at, that I've described earlier, has been described by President Macron as not being, and I quote, an interlude in history. So this is one of the real questions. Are we looking at something which is a temporary phenomenon? At my age, I have grandchildren, but when my adult children were teenagers, you wonder, is the behaviour only a passing phase? And happily, mostly it is. And so we wonder, is this a passing phase? Or is this a new normal? Or is this the beginning of the destruction of things which were carefully constructed over a long period of time? And the truth is, I don't know. I'm really interested. And as all stakeholders, we all have an interest, but I don't know. But I think Macron is right. This is not an interlude in history. There's something going on. It begs the question what the Europeans should do and how far it should go in building strategic autonomy. President Macron favours, and you know it, I quote, building a truly sovereign Europe and building a strong European Union on this sovereignty. He has talked of the need for a real European army, his words, to protect ourselves. Ursula von der Leyen, the German defence minister, has spoken instead of an army of Europeans. And it's pretty familiar to those of us who follow European debates. Do we want a Europe of United States or a United States of Europe? I mean, it's a recyclage of something that we know only so well. This echoes, I think, the debate on defence and army and so on, the wider debate on the future of the EU, with the French president's rallying call for a European renaissance, but responded to by Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer recently, the new leader of the CDU in Germany, emphasising, and I quote, getting Europe right, close quote, and the need to avoid, quote, excessive European centralism, close quote. Both agree on establishing a European Security Council with the UK attached. Where there is unity on aspirations, however, it's not always accompanied by unity on detail. Some commentators have described the current state of play as between wanting more Europe and wanting more of the same Europe, suggesting that the Franco-German engine in which we place such faith on those things from the past, and it has been earned, if and when it operates, may do so in a low gear. Only time will tell. To close, the European Union, as we know, is unique in human history. As Europeans, we know we cannot choose for others. We cannot control what others choose to do, but we can choose for ourselves, making collective choices in our own interest, consistent with our needs and our values, and the needs of the wider world around us. The European Union is, of course, less perfect than many might wish for, but also less imperfect than the caricature presented by its most strident critics. For it to be perfected, to adopt and to reform, first, of course, it must be preserved. 40 years ago, in June 1979, the European Parliament was elected by universal suffrage for the first time. 40 years before that, in June 1939, who could have known that the world, starting in Europe, was about to experience a conflict that would result in the death of 55 million human beings? As we try to look forward for 40 years, what is the legacy that we would like to confer on the future to avoid the vista of that dreadful past and to open a way to the continuity and preservation of something that has served us so well? Support for the European Union today in opinion polls is at a record high, but that now needs to be transformed into support in the ballot box, which election after election was always a new record low in voter turnout. This is a time when, more than ever, Europe needs her Europeans. I greatly look forward to the contributions which we're going to have at this conference today and into tomorrow, and thank you for permitting me to try to set the scene with some opening remarks on the theme of Europe in the world.